We're starting again. My great pleasure to introduce Sam Lebens from Haifa University, who will be talking to us about narrative centers.
Yes. Hi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much to Filippo and Laura for organising this and having me over. Some disclaimers. So first of all, though I was invited, I think, because I had recently published this introduction to philosophy of fiction with my friend in Ireland, Tatiana von Solodkov, more on her later. My main work is really at the intersection of philosophy of fiction and philosophy of religion. And that's where I do most of my philosophizing. And in fact, this project grew out of some thoughts I've had about philosophy of religion, although that shouldn't be obvious to anyone as we move forward. And the other disclaimer is I don't really have a paper written. I have some inchoate ideas that I'd like to share with you in the hope that you might be able to help me sharpen them. And perhaps, in fact, the experience of just sharing them with you will be useful to me. So the first thing I want to think about is the notion in metaphysics of a centered world. And that notion entered into kind of the analytic tradition of philosophy because of puzzles to do with attitudes that are de re and de se. So attitudes about objects and attitudes about ourselves. David Lewis has this now you can get AI just to draw you pictures of anything, right? So this is what this AI did this picture for me. So what that picture is you've got two mountains, a big mountain and a small mountain. On the top of the big mountain, there's a god who throws down thunderbolts. I'm sure, by the way, this is against Jewish law, and I think one of those thunderbolts is going to hit me because you're not supposed to depict gods. But anyway, there's a god on the top of the big mountain throwing down thunderbolts. And there's a god on the top of the smaller mountain throwing down, in Lewis's example, it's manna, their heavenly bread. But I couldn't visualize that so well, so I asked the AI, the candy. But either way, you've got two gods. And Lewis says they're both omniscient. And what that's supposed to mean is for every proposition that's true about the world in which they live, they know it. They believe it. And they don't believe any false propositions. So they believe all of the true propositions that describe their world. But neither of them know which God they are. Right? And the puzzle is, because propositions and the way we tend to think of propositions, if you think of them as sets of worlds or if you think of them as structured entities of some sort that contain the reference of the phrases that express them, whatever it is you might think a proposition is, the notion of first personality drops out of them, right? So they know. So both of those gods know that there's one god on the big mountain throwing down thunderbolts, and both of the gods know that there's a god on the lower mountain throwing down candy, but neither of those gods know which one they are. Okay. Here's another puzzle that was informing them at the time. It's an example that John Perry brought into the literature. He imagines a man walking around a supermarket with a bag of sugar in his trolley, and the bag of sugar is leaking, and it's making a big mess over the supermarket. And John Perry imagines this happening, and he knows loads of things. He knows that there is somebody pushing around a trolley cart with sugar with a leak, and he knows, and he knows that where that man has been recently because he could follow the trail. The one thing, unfortunately, he doesn't know is that he's the man with the he's thinking, oh, what an idiot, that guy, because he doesn't realize it's him. The basic idea is you could know everything that's true de re about the world without knowing things that are true de se about the world. How does that happen? So Lewis wants to say that it's as if the two gods, let's say, they know which world they live in, but they don't know where in that world they are. Okay, so what they really need, what omniscience would really require, is not just a specification of the world that you're in, it would also need a specification of where you are in that world, right? And likewise, John Perry didn't know everything he really should know, right? He may have known all of the kind of de re specifications of the situation in which he was. So he knew which world he was in, but he didn't know where in that world he was, okay? And a center for a world would be something like a specification of where a particular person is, right? Although there is literature now on exactly how to cash out what a center is, because Lewis is he's quite open that he's illustrating it by way of a metaphor. He says, think of a proposition, think of a world, sorry, as a map, and think of a center as an arrow saying you are here, right? Which is very nice, but you might want that cashed out more specific. Okay, yeah, what is a world? Well, you know what Lewis thinks worlds are. They're, concrete spatio-temporal physical manifolds. But what's a center of a world? Okay, maybe you think it's a location, maybe you think it's a coordinate, in that world. Okay. Now, I think it's useful when thinking about fictions to talk about the world of the fiction. Now, we need to be careful here because what I mean by the world of a fiction isn't what Lewis would recognize as a possible world. It's not even what, Plantinga or Robert Adams would recognize as a possible world. So Adams and Plantinga, of course, are the sorts of thinkers that Lewis calls ersatz possible world theorists. So roughly speaking, because there are some small differences between Plantinga and Adams on this view, but they needn't bother us here. Roughly speaking, for them, a possible world is an exhaustive set of propositions. What that means is for any proposition P, a possible world contains either P or its negation. Okay, and obviously for Lewis, possible worlds are something much more concrete than that. Fine. What I mean by a fictional world is they're not going to be exhaustive because, what I mean by a fictional world is without wanting to get too much into the previous talk, the set of propositions that you're being asked to pretend are true for the sake of the fiction. And of course, that set can have lots of gaps in, and therefore you could talk, if you wanted to, you could talk about the worlds of the fiction, right? Every possible world that's compatible with this incomplete set of propositions. But I am just going to talk about the world of the fiction, and I'm just going to allow it to have these gaps in it, right? Fine. One of my interests is to provide a definition of fiction. And I'll say more about my definition of fiction later. But one of the things I think a definition of fiction should be able to do for us is, for any given fiction, specify where our attention is supposed to be. Okay. And I had this really funny thought, right? You could go to the Harry Potter world, or if you prefer, any one of the worlds that's consistent with the narrative of Harry Potter, and just never visit Hogwarts. In fact, never visit London. You could just sit around in Blackburn following some plumber called Bob, right? And you would never know that this was a Harry Potter world, right? You'd be oblivious to the fact this is a Harry Potter world, but you'd be missing the point. You'd be missing the point of the fiction if all you were concentrating on was what Bob the plumber is doing in Blackburn, because J.K. Rowling isn't just drawing your attention to a fictional world. She's drawing your attention to specific things going on in that world, which I would call the narrative center of the world. Exactly how to define a narrative center? Maybe it's a location, right? But it's going to be a four-dimensional region because a narrative has a plot. There's an earlier and a later. It might be discontinuous, right? Because it might be that the narrative's only interested in two disconnected years, and it's not interested in anything that happens in between. So I don't have a completely, as I told you, I gave my disclaimers at the beginning. I don't have a completely worked out definition of what a narrative center is, but I've thrown out some ideas that I hope will give you enough of a grasp of the sort of thing I have in mind. And now I want to talk about some of the work that can do for us. I think ultimately what I want it to do for me, as you'll see, is to play a constitutive role in my definition of fiction. But I think there's also a cool puzzle we can think about that that admitting narrative centers as an important part of our theory of fiction will allow us to resolve. This isn't the puzzle. This is a close by puzzle. So there's a really nice paper by Alan Hazlitt and Christy Magadir from some years back called Unrealistic Fictions. And what they were interested in is when a critic criticizes a piece of fiction for being unrealistic and when they don't. And it's a quite interesting pattern of criticism and non-criticism because, for example, Die Hard 3 was savagely criticized by many critics for being really unrealistic. But as far as I'm aware, and as far as the authors of that paper are aware, The Lord of the Rings wasn't, right? But The Lord of the Rings surely is much less realistic than Die Hard 3. So why is one criticized and one not? And Hazlitt and Magadir come up with what I think is a really neat solution to this putative puzzle. They try to explain what it is that critics are reacting against when they call something unrealistic, okay? Which they didn't feel there was any need to react against in The Lord of the Rings, despite how far away the Lord of the Rings world is from our world and how relatively close the Die Hard world is to our world. Nonetheless, Die Hard is criticized, Lord of the Rings isn't criticized. Why? Well, they say that whenever you consume a fiction, right, you are allowed to, and they're borrowing here heavily from Tamaj Abugendler, you're allowed to import and export. So what the rules for import and export are, and they're going to be very specific to genre. You say, well, let's say you're reading a Sherlock Holmes story and Sherlock Holmes travels from London to Birmingham. You know that he couldn't do that instantaneously. Well, how do you know that he couldn't do that instantaneously? Well, you know roughly what the distance is from London to Birmingham. Well, how do you know what the distance is from London to Birmingham in the Sherlock Holmes world? You're allowed to import that from the real world. Why are you allowed to import that from the real world? Well, the genre of the Sherlock Holmes story somehow makes it apparent to readers what the overlap is between two important sets. The set of propositions that exhaustively describes the actual world, the one with the strudel, the at sign in it. What's it called in Italian, the at sign? What does that mean, literally? Because in Hebrew they call it a snail. Nice. So in Hebrew they call it a strudel, like a cake. Right. It's nice. Right. Anyway, the at sign, a strudel. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I always like to make sure that if I give a talk, people will learn something. So there you go. You've learned something. Okay. Anyway, there are these two overlapping sets: the set of propositions that you take to be true of the actual world, and the set of propositions that you take to be true of the story, what I'm calling the fictional world, even though it might have gaps in, as I said. And the things you're allowed to import into the fiction are things that you take to be in the overlap, and there are subtle cues and conventions that allow a sophisticated reader to know how broad that overlap is supposed to be or how narrow that overlap is supposed to be, and that's going to depend on the genre. You can also export things, which is to say, if you read War and Peace by Tolstoy, you're going to learn a lot about the Franco-Prussian Wars. Well, how can you trust the stuff that you've gleaned from War and Peace about the Franco-Prussian Wars? It's not a history book, it's a novel, right? And you know there's loads of things that aren't true in it. Well, again, a sophisticated reader is supposed to have a kind of working knowledge of where that overlap is, between the two sets, such that even if you didn't know that a proposition was true of the actual world, right? The fact that it's located in the overlap, it's been placed in that overlap, gives you license to export it back into your set of beliefs about the actual world. So it seems, if that's the case, if that's true, and I think that does describe nicely something about the epistemology of fiction, about how we learn things from fiction, then this comparison class, which is the overlap between the two sets, it's actually a really important feature of our practices when consuming fiction. And in fact, I'd want to go so far as to say that, and I really like something that Manuela said about Searle's definition of fiction, or about various definitions of fictions, when they don't seem to have enough explanatory power. And one of the things that I think a definition of fiction should give us is some understanding of why fiction is so important and why we care about it so much. And if it's just people pretending to assert stuff, and that's all we have to say about what fiction is, then okay, right. But fiction is really important to us. It's important to people's lives, important to culture at large. And I think that a definition of fiction should include this notion that to consume a fiction is to compare two worlds. And the worlds are always the world of the fiction and the world in which you live. And because in some sense, every story ends up being about the world in which we live, right? Even if only derivatively or, in a kind of roundabout way, that's going to be part of a broader explanation of what makes fiction so important, and what gives fiction its epistemic capabilities to teach us things about the world in which we live, to teach us things about perhaps how we should live. So the creation of the comparison class, I think, it should be part of a definition of fiction. And I think that if you want to define fiction as comparing two worlds, at some point also narrative centers are going to come in to play, because, as I said, it's not just that an author draws your attention to a particular world, they draw your attention to a particular region of a particular world. But I'll get back to that in a minute. Let me first show you how does Hazlitt and Magadir solve this puzzle. What they say is that unrealistic fiction is fiction that generates a contradiction between what you're supposed to import and what you're supposed to export. So in the Die Hard example, for example, they'd say they're asking you to believe that, what's his name? Bruce Willis. I can't remember what his name is in the film. Anyway, they're asking you to believe that Bruce Willis's character is just an everyday cop. They're also seeming to ask you to believe that that an everyday cop could fly a car off the edge of a highway and hit into a helicopter and survive, right? And I suppose a better, another example they have in their paper is to do with the drama, the long-running TV drama ER, Emergency Room, where George Clooney first made his name as an actor, as a doctor. In that piece of literature, that piece of fiction, that piece of television fiction, you shouldn't honor it with the word literature, but with that work of fiction, you were being asked to believe that it's a relatively realistic hospital environment. And indeed, I'm sure the writers did a certain amount of research, medical research, and had medical kind of advisors, such that the conditions that were being described were real conditions, and that the treatments being prescribed for those conditions were real treatments that really would be prescribed. So you could watch ER and learn stuff about medicine, right? In fact, the comparison class was supposed to be really quite thick, okay? But the vast majority of times in which defibrillation was used, it worked. Right? You know, click, and they put the electric charge on there, and they apparently in real life, the majority of times you use defibrillation, I'm sorry to say, it doesn't work. The person was dead when you started and they're dead when you finished, right? That's it. But in ER, like 80% of the time, right? Okay, so there ends up being a contradiction in your comparison class, because it seems to be a part of the comparison class of ER that defibrillation works the vast majority of the time, but you're also allowed to import anything from the actual world into the comparison class, and it's a fact about the actual world that defibrillation barely works at all. So now you have a contradiction in the comparison class, and that's what's leading to your feeling, oh, that's so unrealistic. Not, you know, and that's why the Lord of the Rings isn't unrealistic. The Lord of the Rings isn't telling us that there really are like people with big hairy feet called hobbits who, and therefore there's no contradiction in the comparison class. There is a comparison class, right? You can learn all sorts of things from the Lord of the Rings about dignity and loyalty and trust and all sorts of stuff. And I suppose the stuff it's trying to get you to explore is about how rational animals should behave in certain situations or might behave in certain situations. Doesn't matter if they're hobbits or elves or just rational animals or something like that. So the stuff that's exportable is more abstract than specifications about what hobbits do or something like that. And the Lord of the Rings isn't unrealistic in this negative sense because it doesn't exhibit contradictions in its comparison class. Fine. So what I've told I told you this would be quite disjointed and incoherent. What I've tried to do so far is say, okay, I was interested in thinking about possible worlds and possible worlds having centers. Then I was interested in thinking about whether there's some kind of some sort of analogy to that in our thinking about fictional worlds. Do fictional worlds have centers? Yes, they do. Narrative centers, the place in the world where the author wants you to look. And then I was like, well, what theoretical use can I put narrative centers to? Well, one thing I think, as I've intimated, is that I think they might form part of our best definition of fiction eventually. But secondly, I promised you there's going to be a puzzle, and I'm going to be able to solve the puzzle by appeal to narrative centers. And the puzzle that I want to think through with you is related to this puzzle, but it's not the same. Okay, so this puzzle was a puzzle about why do we find some seemingly realistic fiction unrealistic when we don't find fantasy, let's say, ipso facto unrealistic. And the answer was to do with contradictions in the comparison class. That at least is the answer provided by Nagadir and Hazlitt, and I think it's very good. Okay, so I want to talk about, when do we criticize fiction, not for being unrealistic, but for being inconsistent? We do criticize, we find plot holes, and often the plot holes are to do with inconsistencies. But there are other fictions that are deliberately inconsistent that we don't criticize for being inconsistent, right? So I really like in her paper on imaginative resistance, Tamar Jaber-Gendler tells this story about Goldbach's Tower. I adore that story, and it's so for those that don't know about it, the idea is that the mathematicians of the world get together and they prove that Goldbach's conjecture that every even number is the sum of two primes. They prove that conjecture, and God is disappointed with them for their audacity. So he takes the number 12 and he makes it no longer the sum of 5 and 7, and that ruins their proof. And all the mathematicians are really upset. So this one particularly righteous mathematician goes to God and says, God, if I can find you, 5 mathematicians that are righteous, would you rescind your decree and make 12 the sum of 5 and 7 again? And God says, no, not even if you found me 5 righteous mathematicians. What if I found you 7 righteous mathematicians? Would you rescind your decree then? No, not even if you found me 7. What about 12? And God says, okay, if you find me 12 righteous mathematicians, I'll restore the number 12 to being the sum of 5 and 7. Unfortunately, this righteous mathematician can only find 5 righteous mathematicians in one town and 7 in another, which would have been 12 before the edict of God, but is 12 no longer, and so on and so forth. And it's completely there are more inconsistencies than I bet than you might want to count in that story. But it's a good story. It serves a kind of comic purpose, and there are various stories I could have used that are explicitly incoherent or inconsistent, let's say, that contain contradictions, and we don't criticize them for that. But as we saw, one of the reasons we criticize fictions for being unrealistic is for containing contradictions. So when is it okay and when is it not okay? So I'm no longer asking the question about realisticness. I'm asking the question about containing contradictions. So we spoke about, can an author make mistakes? Well, yeah, authors can make mistakes. And Arthur Conan Doyle famously made a mistake in the Sherlock Holmes stories because he didn't keep track of where Watson's war wound was, right? So in some stories it's in one place, in other stories it's in another place. But the right answer isn't that it moved, right? He had like a moving war wound. No, it's a contradiction and it's a fault, and you'll be right to criticize. You wouldn't be right for criticizing Goldbach's Tower for containing a contradiction. You would be right for criticizing Sherlock Holmes for containing a contradiction. Why? Okay. In a nutshell, I want to say that the distance from the narrative center of the contradiction is what's making the difference here. I want to say the contradictions in the Goldbach Tower story are right at the center of the narrative center of the world you're being asked to consider, in this case, impossible world you're being asked to consider. And because it's right there front and center, first of all, you couldn't think it was there by mistake. It's too central to the narrative center of the possible world. Of the impossible world, sorry, that you're being asked to consider. And somehow being right there at the center makes it okay. Whereas the contradictions in the Sherlock Holmes story are too peripheral to the narrative center to be plausibly there on purpose. And because they're not plausibly there on purpose, we criticize the author for containing the contradictions, or for allowing the contradictions. So that's nice. Potentially, this notion of narrative center can do a certain amount of work for us in our theory of fiction, explaining when and where we allow contradictions to exist in fiction, and when and where we kind of criticize them for doing it. I think it's interesting to note, by the way. So David Lewis tries to explain, in another article in the 1970s, tries to explain truth in fiction as in terms of sets of possible worlds, okay? And he is famously going to struggle to account for impossible fictions, because there are no possible worlds in which the number 12 is not the sum of 5 and 7, or that God makes it not the sum of 5 and 7. That's an impossible world. You could save Lewis's whole picture by admitting that there are places called impossible worlds, but for various reasons you might not want to do that. And what's interesting is Lewis is the guy that raises to the philosophical community's attention that Sherlock Holmes contains that. David Lewis was a massive Sherlock Holmes fan. That's just a piece of background that seems to have affected the history of analytic philosophy and all of our examples. But that's an interesting sociological historical fact. But Lewis is aware of the contradictions in the home story, and he designs these technical fixes. But what's really interesting, if you read that paper, is he can only really fix contradictions that are peripheral to a narrative. He can't fix contradictions that are right there in the center of the narrative, like in the Goldbach story. And I think that's telling, because I think that it's only when contradictions are in the narrative center of the world that they're really allowed to be there. Okay, one other thought that I have to share before. How much time have I used up?
You got 5-10 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, so there's one other thought. I'll try and develop it, and this is why I've got a picture of my colleague Tatiana there. So we put together this intro to philosophy of fiction. It's called Thinking About Stories, and we each wrote our own chapter, and we each wrote our own chapters, sorry, and then we kind of pop up in each other's chapter with objections, and it's kind of supposed to be a kind of move towards a textbook that has more dialogue in it rather than just straight prose. One of her chapters was on this notion of ubiquitous narrators, right? Does every story have a narrator? And in written fiction, it becomes quite plausible, I think. It becomes quite plausible to say that every written fiction has at least an implicit, if not an explicit, narrator. But in movies, the question becomes really difficult to resolve, okay? It seems as if when we're watching a movie, we're pretending that we're seeing fictional events. What we're really seeing is obviously actors pretending to be people. I don't know what their mental states are. Actors delivering lines, right? We're watching actors delivering lines, but we pretend that we're watching people speaking, not actors delivering lines, right? We pretend that we're watching these fictional events as if they're not fictional. And then the question becomes, well, how are we seeing them? Right? Who's presenting these things to us? Right? Now, in some films, that's made explicit, right? If it's a mockumentary, right, then there's a whole story within the story as to how these things were filmed and edited and presented to us. Fine. But when you're watching Saving Private Ryan, right, if you start worrying, oh my God, how did the cameraman not get blown up moving through that, moving through Normandy Beach with all those no, the cameraman isn't part of the and yet you're seeing it. Well, how are you seeing it? Are you imagining that you're there? Well, if you're imagining that you're there, why are you not ducking, right? You should be worried about your own safety. No, so you're imagining you're seeing a film of it, but are you imagining that somebody filmed it? No, you're not imagining that if I've understood Tatiana's response to these set of problems correctly, I think Tatiana ends up saying that the entire institution of movie consumption, apart from in exceptional cases like mockumentary, is riddled with inconsistency. Every movie tells an inconsistent story, right? Beardsley has this idea of silly questions. In the literature and movie studies about this area of questions, this area of theory, is there always a narrator? The ubiquity or lack thereof of an implicit narrator in movies. You get this avalanche of silly questions, right? I remember when I was a kid, watching The Lion King for the first time, and I was watching it with a friend of mine who was really, really gullible. And I said to her, isn't that amazing how they got that camera so high to watch over and she was like, yeah. It was animated, so poor thing. But it's a silly question anyway, right? So you're watching a musical. and you ask, where did the orchestra come from? Right? Is there an orchestra practicing next door? Right? And how do they all know the dance moves? Those are the wrong questions, right? Likewise, questions about, even in more realistic fiction, like Saving Private Ryan, how is it that I am getting access to these pictures? How is it that I'm able to see these things? It's a silly question. You shouldn't ask the question. But why is it a silly question? And Tatiana's response is, it's just too far away from the plot. So if that's right, then it turns out there's like this weird, really weird kind of bell curve where contradictions in a story are okay if they're right at the narrative center, or if they're really, really, really far away from the narrative center. Because Tatiana wants to say that basically every film you watch, unless it's like a mockumentary or a pretend documentary, I make the distinction because mockumentary is supposed to be comedy, but I could imagine like a drama, you know, fictional documentary, not mocking anything. Apart from in those exceptional genres of movie, every film you watch is contradictory, because every film you watch has these questions about how you're seeing what you're seeing that can only be answered in ways that end up contradicting themselves. But don't worry about it, it's fine. Because those are bad questions. They're silly questions. What makes them silly questions? They're too far away from the narrative center to warrant our attention. So then it turns out that as I said, we allow contradictions in fiction when they're right at the center of the narrative. We allow contradictions in fiction when they're so far away from the center that to worry about them would be to miss the point of the fiction. But we don't like it when there are contradictions maybe in the middle ground between those two extremes. Right? If you're criticizing Watson, so if you're criticizing Conan Doyle for allowing Watson to have this contradictory war wound, then what you're saying is, you know, that wasn't sufficiently far away from the narrative center for me to let you off about that one. So potentially this notion of narrative centers does some theoretical work for us in the philosophy of fiction, and I commend them to you. And that's all I have to say, I think.